Okay, audio check. Welcome everyone to Uncle John's cabin.
Take it easy, Uni. He's a good guy.
Today I'm feeling actually in a really good mood, in a really strange mood. I'm feeling excitement for the first time in many years. I watched a movie recently. It was a recent movie, which is quite strange because a lot of the time these recent movies and TV shows just haven't really been for me. I'm not going to start getting into the culture wars here and talking and reviewing modern movies because there's already 1,000 YouTube channels that do that. But what I'm saying is I haven't seen a movie that's really made me feel this excited since I was very, very young. And the movie in question is Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons Honor Amongst Thieves, I think it's called. It was absolutely fantastic. I'm not going to make this a review because on Friday I will be sitting with good friend Playful Mind Gaming, and we will together be doing a podcast about this movie. I'll put a link to the podcast on SoundCloud in the bottom. I'll also put a link to Playful Mind Gaming, who's got an amazing channel. He looks at lots of older games like Ultima. Big fan of Ultima, he is. I don't really have much knowledge of it. But also more contemporary games like Baldur's Gate and Warhammer 40k. But we'll be taking apart the movie and explaining why both of us felt such a sense of excitement. It really did capture the spirit of the game. And it really felt like you could almost see a group of players sitting and playing this. It had a lot of comedy, it had great action, and yeah, the characters had flaws, and they all came together. I mean, it sounds a bit cliche, but they all came together and grew, and the party became greater than the sum of its parts. Amazing. But this movie got me really into. It reawakened. I mean, it never went away, my interest in Dungeons and Dragons. For example, I have a map of Faerun right behind me there. I've always had an interest in fantasy and into Dungeons and Dragons. But right now, I just really want to talk about it. And I want to use this episode of Uncle John's Cabin to just... My relationship with Dungeons and Dragons kind of transcends a simple fan and game. This thing really shaped who I was, or who I am, as a person. The adventures, I normally played the Dungeon Master. I was normally the one who wrote the adventures and brought the party together. I did play as a character a few times, but I really loved writing the adventures. I used to dream about the adventures and write them down the next day. And a lot of the games came from my sleep and my dreams. And I would love to read the rule books and the story books. I mean, you can write your own adventures, but you do get modules where you can buy and run the adventures. And some of them, I mean, where do we begin? I mean, I know this is going to be I don't want to make this a really long video. I don't want to make one of these videos which seem to be quite popular now, where somebody takes something like Morrowind or Dungeons and Dragons and calls it a short overview of Dungeons and Dragons, and it's a 7.5 hour long video. Let's start from the very beginning. I was first introduced to Dungeons and Dragons through a game called Dragon Strike. Now this was my first Dungeons and Dragons adventure. It was made for children. It came out in '93 by TSR, Tactical Strategic Rules. It's called. Oh, I can't remember the name of it. It'll flash up on screen. Tactical. Oh, do you know what? I'm going to check on my phone. Hold on. Made by TSR, and it was called Tactical Study Rules. That's what it stood for. And they released this as a gateway for younger people, or I mean, it was aimed at kids, but it was basically a simpler version of Dungeons and Dragons. And what was cool about it is, unlike normal board games at the time, there was a lot of promotion of interaction and like lateral thinking and problem solving. Like, you could really say what you wanted to do. Like, let me give you an example. Like, you're walking down a corridor and you hear two orcs, one of the classic antagonists in the game, talking. Normally in the board game, you'd be quite, even in a video game, it would be quite restrictive to what you could do. But in this game, you could really use your mind, and you could say something along the lines of, I want to throw a stone to distract them. And then you would get a bonus on the attack if the distraction worked. Everything was worked out using dice, so the element of chance. Or you could go and engage them in a conversation. You could say, hey, we're lost, we're travelling wine cellars, and we have bottles of wine, and whatever you came up with. And it allowed you to do this. It was still quite basic in its rules. I mean, remember, it was meant predominantly for the younger audiences. But I remember playing that and being so fascinated about how you could suggest anything, as long as it was realistic to an extent, and it was based on a dice roll. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep into the mechanics of these games, because when we start talking about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition as it's most commonly known, we could spend hours talking about the rules. So I'm talking more about the concept and the ideas, especially the artwork for these things. The artwork was absolutely sensational. Even for Dragonstrike, the Dragonstrike box cover was fantastic. But where Dragonstrike stood out was it came with a VHS, so a videotape, which was shot in, I think it was called Hyper Reality. It was basically green screened and computer generated effects, which were very limited at the time, but gave it a certain charm. Played by B-list or C-list actors, and you had this wonderful dungeon master who really took, I think it was called the Games Master in Dragonstrike, but he really took on the role, and it was very funny, and it became something that my friends would watch to laugh at. Such was its unintentional comic elements.
For sorcerers. Sorcerers! Like this miserable Teraptus. They never pay. You always end up broke. You! I mean me! I go to collect my money, and next thing you know, I'm hypnotizing a sin I don't want it. Alright. I don't want it. I mean, I do want it. But they tricked me. I just told you, I mean me. Don't you pay any attention.
Hey, Elf, what is this thing?
You miserable...
An owlbear. They're not nearly as extinct as they should be.
Here, it's up you and me.
Try flattering him.
I talked to you.
Flattering
I can have
him?
better company up here. And, you know...
Hey, handsome.
Hey, oh, hey, come back.
But it still gave a fantastic introduction to the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Afterwards, I bought the box set, and I must have been 12 or 13 at the time, and it sat in my bedroom for years. I tried to play it with my father, but when we got onto the Thakor rule, which some of you veteran players will understand, it really became confusing, and I didn't play it. But a couple of years later, a rather smart friend of mine managed to work out the rules, and we actually played it with a group, and it was fantastic. But I want to talk about the imagery and 2nd editions, the many books it came with that really fed a young person's imagination, really gave me great ideas for adventures. I just read the books without even playing. I mean, this is before we had the world of online, so you had to organise a group of friends to come together. When you did come together, you'd play for a couple of hours, and then it'd be a week, 2 weeks, sometimes a month before you played again. So there was a lot of downtime. And I would just read these books. And you had 1st edition and 2nd edition at the time of when I played. The first edition books, they were absolutely bonkers. You had books on gods and deities. You had books on demons, on angels. You had you had like the wilderness survival guides, all beautifully illustrated with some wonderful artwork. In the second edition, you even had these player handbook extensions where you would have the ninja's handbook, the bard's handbook, the druid's handbook, and then you'd have books on races, like you would have books on dwarves, books on on elves, books on halflings, which were basically hobbits, but they weren't allowed to call them hobbits because of the token estate, so they were halflings. And you could just read, and then they had rule expansions like combat and tactics and skills and powers, high level campaigns where basically your character at the end becomes a god. All, as I say, illustrated with the most beautiful artwork. A lot of female characters were beautifully illustrated, giving birth to the scantily clad femme fatales and the cliche which is now chainmail
bikini.
However, as a young man, I certainly wasn't complaining. I want to finish this first introductory segment by talking about my first real adventure, where I wasn't the dungeon master. So we had played as kids, finding our feet with the game, but we had a gaming group that came together, run by a former heroin addict, now dungeon master, called Richard, otherwise known as Floyd. He was quite a character, as you can probably imagine, and he brought along with him a young chap called Gary, who was a promising would-be politician. So, the heroin addict and the politician, it's almost like an Aesop's fable, that. But I was also joined by child genius, my friend James, who was incredibly intelligent, and my good friend Gavin, who was incredibly witty and funny. So, what an adventuring group we had. I played a halfling called Simon Quickfingers, who was a thief, based a lot on the Robin Hood kind of character. He was a good guy, but he would often get himself into trouble. Maybe I'll even do a video especially on this, because this is a topic I could talk for hours on, but I want to do these as short, easy to digest videos. Maybe I'll put them together as a compilation at the end. But first of all, I just want to highly recommend you go see Dungeons and Dragons. I highly recommend you subscribe to Playful Mind Gaming, and I highly recommend, in fact I would go as far as to command you to keep watching these short videos I'm going to make on the world of Dungeons and Dragons, because all this has been kept in my... We didn't even talk about the Psychonics Handbook, one of my most favourite pieces of literature of all, with illustrations that to this day boggle my mind. But you could almost think of this as a trailer, because I'll make the videos longer, but it's fresh in my mind after seeing the movie, and I'm really happy to get it out there and see where this series of videos will take us. The gods only know. Well, there we are. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned, because great things are coming, and they will be dragons. Goodbye.
What madness is this?
I think they're starting to get suspicious.